Readiness is not necessary for growth. It is not necessary to process grief. You just have to have the purpose and the resolve to be able to change something.
Get your daily dose of motivation on the Motivational Moments with Michelle podcast. In Motivation with Michelle podcast, you'll get encouraging, uplifting, and life-changing wisdom that will transform your world at your fingertips, 24 hours a day. Get a fuller, deeper revelation of the tools you can implement to see incredible transformation in your life from Michelle Newstedter's powerful teachings. Tune in whenever you need to be edified, uplifted, or a dose of motivation, no matter where you are. Subscribe to Motivational Moments with Michelle podcast with Michelle Newstedter today on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or SoundCloud.
Even in that statement that you had just made around where, people will come to this place of saying like, nope, I'm not going there. Nope, I'm not dealing with this. That in and of itself is a choice to remain kind of stuck right where you're at in that moment, right? Because not allowing yourself to open it up, not allowing yourself to hear the inner narrative, not allowing yourself to share that narrative really does keep us in that sort of stuck space. And I learned that. And so a lot of the learnings and things that I've pulled from my life come from some of either the traumas or the losses that I've really experienced in my world. And in 2018, I lost my brother. And it was quite a challenge. It was a very difficult loss for me. And I had a really hard time talking about it. One of the things that helped me was I actually went to IMC in March of the following year. So 2019, I went to IMC in March. Wow. And I had planned my little 5-minute speech and was ready. And I was one of the table leaders and whatever, blah, blah, blah. And we're doing everybody's doing their little 5-minute speeches, and they actually put a break in between. So a few people had gone and then they put a break in, and then we came back to finish the table speeches. And on that break, I'm looking at my notes for my 5-minute speech. And I basically crumpled it up, and I'm like, nope, I'm going to talk about my brother. So I went back, stood up, did my 5 minutes, and I cried. It was probably the hardest 5-minute table speech I have ever done.
And probably the most impactful speech most of the people at that table had ever heard.
And then after I finished it, then I was like, that was so good for me. So I came back home. After that, I've been a member of Toastmasters for quite a while. I took a break over the last year though from that, but post coming back from IMC, I started incorporating it into different things that I would talk about and different speeches that I would make and things like that, because I found that it was so healing to include it in my narrative. So it kind of brings us all the way back around to healing loss through language.
So could we actually say with some level of confidence that the path to healing involves not only processing, but maybe sharing? Can we keep it in and heal? Or is it like any other law of physics? If we keep that in, it's gonna intensify. We're gonna be overwhelmed with this. How do we let the pressure off unless we have some kind of a bleeder valve where we can let that pressure out? Is there a correlation between having supports, finding the courage to share, and our healing? What do you think?
Well, I've always said that human beings are social creatures and that we're designed for a community. We're designed for relationship. And you can't have relationship without some form of connection. And that requires us to have that ability to communicate. And I don't know if you noticed it or not, but the best relationships we have are the ones that we connect at kind of like a deeper emotional sort of level and space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the word that I'll use all the time, is intimacy. some people don't understand when I use that word because it's the vulnerability side of it. Those relationships tend to go deeper than the surface because we let people see. And this is what you're doing with your audience. You're putting yourself out there saying, here's a bit of my story. It's not my identity, but it's a part of my story. And the more you've learned to share, first your son, now your brother, two very different losses. One was completely out of your control. The other one was in many ways an injustice because your brother never got the supports that he needed. So there's that other part of us that wrestles with the anger side of the stages of grief going, this could have been preventable. What do we do? And then how do we grieve? The one, no control. The other one, no control with you, no responsibility with you, but it hurts even more different because it's like, this was an injustice. And then we think of the losses that people go through, myself even, not that I want to minimize anything that you're sharing, but I'm familiar with loss, but it's not necessarily death. For me, it's more intangible than that. I lost a relationship with my father when I was 4. I've been working that into my narrative most of my adult life, but my whole relationship with my dad consisted of a card once a year and $50 going, hey kid, that was my relationship. He was there, but never there, missing all my events, too busy with his second family and my half sister and travel and stuff like that. And it took probably 25 years before we started to actually have a real relationship. But that's patterned so many things that I've struggled with. And even knowing how to be a father to my own kids without that template, loss has affected so many of those relationships because I didn't know what I was doing because I had no healthy example of what appropriate male role modeling would look like. So, I mean, to me, that's probably my most significant loss because I've watched how it's like, I remember bursting into tears at 17 years old when I first played catch with a guy at Bible college. The first time I caught a ball, I wish that was my dad I was playing catch with. I never had those memories. But the weight of that hit me that day and I was just broken because I hadn't learned how to process that stuff. And it did define me for many years until I started doing my own work, kind of like what you're describing.
Yeah, and well, that's what I mean. I said like loss is loss, right? Like it doesn't have to be something specific as my stories. But there's other losses that we've experienced in our lives that still create a storm, that still create pain, that still create this potential for a story.
Yeah.
How I choose to have that story be within my world, to be how I choose to tell that story, how I choose to connect with that story, how I choose to define myself within that story will all impact the future, our goals, the path I go down, the growth I have, that type of thing, right? When you're a child and you have a loss like that, you, again, just like you said with my story, right? Like part of that's out of your control. And you may not even know that you needed to retell that story or rewrite that story. But there came a point in your world where it was like, oh, okay, this is very real for me. And now I need to start to shift that narrative, right? And so this takes us back to that idea of the community, right? And being connected with people and how we connect with people on a deeper level through the like emotional vulnerability and those types of pieces, yeah. Which is why it is such a huge part of our healing process. Because we really do connect and we kind of share that weight, we share that load, we allow space. We allow space for somebody else to hold it for a little while. We allow space to retell the narrative as we currently see it. We allow space to even reflect on how do I need to start to rewrite this. But we might not know what that looks like until we actually start to share it. And I mean, not everybody's ready to say those words out loud. And you know what? Sometimes that's where a journal comes in handy.
Yes, I'm glad you threw that in there. It's a great indirect way of sort of processing. Actually, I wouldn't even say that's indirect. That is a great way to start dealing with it and getting those thoughts out.
and I don't ever want to minimize anybody's loss in any way, shape, or form. So when we are talking about these strategies and this retelling the narrative and not being stuck and that type of thing, it's not in any way to minimize what you're going through in the storm and how that looks like for you right now.
Right.
The intent is just to start to explore how do we start to move through that space then?
Right.
What are some of the things that maybe I need to reflect on? What are some of those lines in the sand or non-negotiables that maybe I do need to start to think about and put in place in my own world? Like I said, with my second youngest, I maybe could have put a non-negotiable in place there where I was like, nope, like I'm not going to choose fear. But it took me a little bit longer to come to that place, which is why I did it for the last one, right? And then I was able to put that non-negotiable in place. And for each of us, we have to kind of like work towards and come to that place where we're ready to put something new. Yep.
That was the trigger. Okay. Thank you. You just said that, and that brought back my train of thought. So readiness. If we're not ready to share, we use journaling. Good alternative. But is readiness actually required to deal with grief? Or would there be something more potent or more powerful than readiness? And you're shaking your head. You know where I'm going with this, which is great. It's not about readiness, guys. If any of you are listening and you think, I am not ready to deal with this, leaders are seldom ready to do things. We are purposed. The one thing that makes Michelle and I maybe grieve differently than many is we find a purpose in spite of that grief. Purpose is what drives behavior. It's not readiness. Many of us, if we're being honest, we're not ready to get married. We're not ready to have kids. We're not ready to start that business. But we face fears. We go into those risky areas because of purpose, not because of readiness. So do not stay on the fence of indecision because you feel I'm not ready to deal with my emotions. Readiness is not necessary for growth. It is not necessary to process grief. You just have to have the purpose and the resolve to be able to change something.
Because we often like think about it in terms of like readiness, and we'll often say things like, I'm just not ready. And that's just going to keep us here. It's just going to keep me stuck in wherever I am.
Yeah.
Because you're right. I'll never be ready. However, that being said, right? If I'm not in a space where I can share this with others yet, maybe there's other ways for me to start. Maybe there's other ways for me to get started, because then I'm getting started.
No, I was just thinking, it might sound really childish, but I started smiling inside when I started thinking of hide and go seek. And what do people say at the very end when they're done counting?
Ready or not, here I come.
That's right. Imagine we could say that to our fear, to the grief and the loss that we're going through. Ready or not, here I come. The best is still in front of us, guys. We're not used up. We don't live in the past. We learn to go through things in order to get through things. And that all comes back to choice. And we don't have to be ready. So ready or not, what will you do with your grief? Ready or not, what will you do with your story, your mess? Will it become your message? Or will it become your identity? Both are choices. And I would encourage everybody to use your choice wisely. Ready or not, how will you grieve?